58, 59,
The wind off
60.
Quiet Ledge carried the smell
Mama,
of
look
frost
what I
before
found.
frost ever came. And Vesta Calloway had learned to read that smell the way other women read scripture. 40 miles from Fortune's Rest,
see it.
the shelf of land her husband's family had
Are the
claimed
children
sat
close
wedged
behind?
between two granite walls
I feel
like an
like I'm
afterthought.
flying.
The mountain
Oh
hadn't
my
bothered
goodness,
to finish,
this is
and on the morning the
magnificent.
first hard wind of October came through, she stood at the woodpile counting logs, the way a banker counts coin. He already knows isn't enough. Her wool dress, the hem let down twice already since she'd first sewn it, hung heavy with the cold sleeves rolled past her elbows, despite the chill, because chopping wood in loose cuffs only invited trouble. Thomas was at the table behind her, his bad leg propped on the bench, working a harness strap, with hands that had gotten very good at small, precise tasks, because the large ones had been taken from him 18 months back when a spooked horse had put him under a wagon wheel and left the bone in his shin healed crooked. He did not complain about it. He had simply stopped being the one who split wood, and Vesta had simply started, and neither of them had spoken the transition aloud, the way you don't speak aloud the things that have already happened and can't be undone by discussing them. 61, she said, not turning around. That's what we've got cut. We'll need closer to 90 to get through to March. Thomas didn't look up from the strap. I did the arithmetic twice. I know what we'll need. Her voice carried no heat, only the flat patience of a woman stating a fact she'd already absorbed and moved past. Knowing it and having it are different problems. Asa came through the door, then 8 years old, and moving like he'd been launched from somewhere, his boots loud on the puncheon floor, a fistful of something clutched against his chest like a secret he was bursting to keep. He'd been gone since breakfast off toward the eastern wall where the boy went most mornings, now that the chores were light enough to spare him, and Vesta felt the particular tightening in her stomach that came whenever he ran instead of walked, because running boys found things, and finding things in this territory could go either direction. Mama! He stopped in front of her breathless and opened his hand to show 3 flat gray stones unremarkable to anyone but a child who collected unremarkable things with the seriousness other people reserve for gold. The rock's breathing. The rock doesn't breathe, Asa. It does. He was already turning, pulling at her sleeve, the stones forgotten back into his pocket. Come feel it. It's warm where it shouldn't be warm. Vesta looked at Thomas, and Thomas looked back at her with the particular expression he wore when he was deciding whether something was worth the walk on a leg that ached worse in cold weather. He set the harness strap down. Go on, he said. I'll catch up slower. The crack ran up the east-facing granite about chest height to well over Vesta's head, no wider at any point than the spread of 2 hands, and she might have walked past it 100 times in 3 years of crossing that ground for water or for game, except that something about the boy's insistence made her actually stop and put her palm flat against the stone the way he'd shown her. The rock was cool exactly where rock should be cool. But there was a column of air rising off the gap itself, not touching the stone, just moving through the space the stone had failed to close, and that air carried warmth the way a kitchen carries warmth past an open door. She held her hand there longer than she meant to. You feel it. Asa said, not a question, already certain of the answer, because he had never once doubted his own discoveries. I feel something. She leaned her face close enough to breathe it in, and the smell underneath the cold mountain air was mineral and faintly sweet, the way creek water smells in August before you've seen the creek. Behind her slower, she heard Thomas's uneven gait on the rocky ground, and she didn't turn until he'd nearly reached them, because something in her wanted one more moment alone with whatever this was before she had to share the deciding of it. Well, Thomas put his own palm against the stone, and his face did something Vesta had seen only a handful of times in 9 years of marriage, a kind of stillness that meant he was working a problem he didn't yet have the shape of. That's not nothing. Could be a cave full of bad air, Vesta said. Could be a sinkhole behind it with no bottom we can see. Could be. He withdrew his hand. Could be a great many things, most of them disappointing. But neither of them moved away from the crack, and the wind kept coming through the pass behind them, and Asa stood between his parents with the unshakable patience of a boy who had already decided the same way he'd decided about every frog and coin and odd stone he'd ever carried home, that this was something, and that the only remaining question was how soon the grown-ups would catch up to what he already knew. They didn't go in that day. There was a half-mended harness on the table in wood that wasn't yet split into the 90 logs Thomas had calculated, And Vesta was not a woman who let curiosity outrun necessity. Whatever Ace's face was doing at supper, whatever silent calculations, she could see him running behind his eyes about how he might sneak back alone in the morning. She told him plainly that he would not go in without her, and he agreed too quickly for her to fully trust it. And that night she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind find every gap in the chinking, thinking about warm air rising out of cold stone, in a season when warm air was the only thing standing between her family and a winter that had already shown its teeth twice in the last 3 years. She packed a length of rope before she'd consciously decided to. She found it coiled in her hands at the bench by the door the following dawn, and she did not examine too closely what that meant. The passage, when they finally entered it together 2 days later with Thomas's lantern, throwing a clean circle of light and his bad leg making the narrow stretches slower than Vesta would have liked, ran back into the mountain further than any of them had guessed. From the outside the walls, pressing close enough at first that Vesta had to turn her shoulders sideways, the stone cold and damp against her coat. Asa had gone ahead the moment the gap widened enough to let him, ignoring every instruction to stay behind the lantern, and Vesta's heart kept time with her steps as she called his name into the dark, and heard his voice come back from somewhere unseen, bright with a discovery he didn't yet have words for. Then the walls stepped back, not gradually, but the way a held breath finally lets go, and Vesta came around a leftward bend in the stone into a space that made her stop walking entirely. It was a basin of rock, perhaps 30 feet across the ceiling, fractured into overlapping slabs that let down thin fingers of outside light through fissures. She couldn't see the source of the light catching on moisture in the air, so the whole chamber glowed faintly, neither lamplight nor daylight, but something between the two that made the granite itself look softer than granite had any right to look. Asa stood near the center with his arms out and his face turned up, and Vesta understood, watching him, that she was seeing something on her son's face she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe to people who hadn't stood here. Along the eastern wall, water wept steadily from a horizontal seam in the stone, running down a natural lip into a shallow basin before vanishing through a lower crack in the floor. And when Vesta knelt and put her fingers into it, the water was warm, not hot, but warm, the way a creek runs warm in July, and it was the second week of October with frost already silvering the grass outside every morning. Iron, she said, tasting it, and something underneath, not unpleasant. Thomas tasted it after her and agreed, his eyes moving across the chamber, the way they moved across a ledger, cataloging rather than admiring, though she could see the admiration sitting underneath the cataloging all the same. He paced the floor twice, testing the level stretches, running his hand along a series of natural ledges worked into the northern wall by water and time, deep enough in places to hold goods off a cold floor even and dry. This could keep meat through to spring, he said. Keep it cool without freezing it solid. This could keep us warm through to spring. Vesta straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt, already moving past wonder into the calculation that had governed every winter of her married life. I don't care what it looks like, Thomas. I care what it does. It can do both. She looked at him then, and something passed between them that didn't need further words. A recognition that they had each been handed the same gift, and were already reaching for it with different hands. His curious and careful, hers urgent, and already 3 steps into planning. Asa had found a patch of low green growth near the seep wall and was crouched over it, poking it with one finger, declaring it alive in a tone that suggested he found this both obvious and remarkable. They stayed the better part of an hour. When they came back out into the gray afternoon, the wind had sharpened and the temperature had dropped, and Vesta turned to look at the crack in the rock with the particular focus she reserved for problems that had just become solutions. It's ours, she said, not as a claim to be defended, but as a fact already settled in her chest. Whatever it costs to make it useful, it's ours, and we're going to use it. The work began the following Monday because Vesta Calloway had never in her life let a discovery sit idle when there was daylight enough to act on it. She spent the first 2 mornings outside on the upper face with a cold chisel borrowed from the smithy in town, widening 2 of the natural fissures, a careful 1/4 inch at a time, checking below with each strike where Thomas sat with the lantern, watching the light shift through the ceiling above him, and calling up corrections when the angle wasn't right. Her shoulders ached in a way they hadn't ached since the early years of homesteading, and she found she didn't mind it because the ache had a purpose attached to it that the ordinary aches of subsistence farming had stopped having years ago. By the second day's end, the light fell through in a clean column thin as a handspan, moving across the basin floor as the sun crossed overhead, and Asa stood directly in it, the first time it struck full strength, and announced that it felt like standing in a room with the window thrown open in summer. Thomas took the seep wall as his task since it required patience and careful hands rather than strength, and Vesta watched him spend 3 mornings with a tin cup and flattened stones, redirecting the water's path along a small levee of river clay he'd hauled in through the passage section by section, his bad leg planted at an angle that let him work without putting weight on it wrong. By the third day, he had the water running in a controlled channel, pooling shallow and warm and clean enough for washing. And when Vesta saw what he'd built without complaint about the leg or the cold stone floor under him, she felt something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite pride, but sat close enough to both that she didn't bother separating them. "You didn't have to do that today," she said. "Your leg, my leg does what I tell it mostly." He didn't look up from the channel. "And I wanted this done before the cold settles deeper. You've got enough to carry without carrying me too." She didn't answer that directly because there wasn't a way to answer it that didn't risk more honesty than either of them wanted standing in a half-finished cave. But she crouched beside him and helped seat the last stone of the levee, and the silence between them afterward felt like agreement. The shelves took the better part of a week. Vesta cut and dried pine in sections short enough to carry through the bend in the passage, notching frames to sit level on the uneven stone with a handsaw that left blisters. She didn't mention to anyone, and Thomas measured and marked while seated, directing where each plank should sit so the load would distribute right across the natural ledges. By the end of October, they had root vegetables, dried herbs, 2 crocks of preserved beans, and the season's cured meat stored on shelves that kept everything out of weather for the first time in 3 winters on that shelf of land. The sleeping nook against the western curve of the basin wall was Vesta's idea, built where the stone held its warmth most steadily, a platform of planks on low legs to keep bedding off cold rock, with a curtain of heavy wool hung from a bent wire rod to close the space off from the rest of the chamber. The first night, the 3 of them slept inside it. Asa was asleep before Thomas had finished trimming the lantern wick, and Vesta lay listening to the seep's small, continuous sound, thinking that it carried something like rain, without any of the trouble rain usually brought to a roof that wasn't built to hold against it. "You haven't smiled like that in longer than I want to admit noticing," Thomas said quietly into the dark, and Vesta felt the observation land somewhere she hadn't expected it to reach. "I've had less to smile about," she said. "That's not a complaint. It's just been true." "I know it's been true." His voice carried no apology, only the steady acknowledgement of a man who'd watched his wife absorb a weight that should have been shared between 2 working bodies and wasn't anymore. "I mean to find a way to carry more of it again, even with the leg." "You carry plenty, Thomas." She meant it, and she let the meaning sit in the dark rather than dressing it up further, because some things needed only to be said once to be believed. Word moved through the valley the way water moves, finding its own level and slipping into places nobody had thought to guard, and by mid-November, 3 families near Fortune's Rest knew there was something unusual happening on the Callaway shelf, though none of them knew the particulars. Vesta hadn't told anyone deliberately. She suspected without proof she could point to that the leak had come from Asa, who had mentioned at the schoolhouse to a friend that his family had a secret warm cave the way an 8-year-old mentions a marvel he cannot be expected to understand as a liability. She didn't scold him for it when she finally pieced together where the talk had started. She simply sat him down at the table one evening and explained in terms a boy could hold on to that some things you found belong to the people who found them until they decided otherwise, and that talking too freely about a good thing could sometimes bring people who wanted to take it rather than admire it. "Like Mr. Stroud?" Asa asked, and Vesta felt something cold move through her because she hadn't mentioned Bartholomew Stroud by name, and the fact that her son had landed on that name unprompted told her the boy had heard more talk at school than she'd realize. "Why do you say like Mr. Stroud?" "Tommy Pruitt said his pa told him Mr. Stroud's been asking around about our land, about the rock wall." Asa's face had gone uncertain, the easy confidence of his discoveries giving way to something closer to worry, an expression Vesta hadn't seen on him before and didn't like seeing now. "Did I do something bad, Mama?" "No." She said it firmly enough that she half believed it herself. "You found something wonderful, and wonderful things get talked about. That's not a fault in you." But that night, after Asa was asleep in the basin nook and Thomas had banked the cabin fire, Vesta sat at the table with the lamp turned low and thought about Bartholomew Stroud in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. He ran cattle on better ground 2 miles north and had been in this valley 16 years to her family's 6. And he was a man who measured his own standing by how much of the territory's uncertainty he'd already settled in his own mind. What the valley didn't widely know, though, Vesta had heard the edges of it from a supplier in town who'd mentioned it in passing, was that Stroud's herd had taken a hard loss the previous winter to Blackleg, and that he'd borrowed heavily against the spring calving to cover it, a debt that hadn't been fully answered by the calves he'd actually managed to bring to market. A man in that position needed something to show a bank, and rock that might hold ore was exactly the kind of something a desperate man could be persuaded to believe in, whether or not the believing made sense. She had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times in those 6 years, always pleasant, always brief, and she had noticed without dwelling on it that he was a man who did not like being told the ground he'd walked past for 16 years held something he hadn't already accounted for. She mentioned none of this to Thomas that night, not because she meant to keep it from him, but because saying it aloud felt like giving it more shape than she wanted it to have before it had earned that shape on its own. It earned that shape on a cold, bright afternoon in late November when Stroud rode up to the shelf unannounced, his horse blowing steam, his manner so carefully neighborly that Vesta felt the wrongness of it before he'd said a dozen words. He admired the cabin. He asked after Thomas's leg with what might have been genuine concern. And then with the easy transition of a man who had planned the conversation on the ride over, he asked about the rock face on the eastern boundary, the one he understood the family had taken to working on. Just shoring up some storage, Vesta said, which was true enough not to feel like a lie, even as she felt the careful flatness of her own voice. Nothing more than that. Storage in a rock face. Stroud's eyes moved past her toward the granite wall, calculating something she couldn't read. That's industrious of you, Mrs. Calloway. Wouldn't have thought it of that ground. Always took it for nothing but rock and wind, same as everybody else. Then I suppose everybody else was looking at it the wrong way. He smiled at that, but it didn't reach the rest of his face, and he stayed another few minutes making conversation that circled without ever quite landing on what he wanted to know before riding off the way he'd come. Vesta stood watching him go longer than she needed to, and when she turned back toward the cabin, she found Thomas standing in the doorway, having heard enough of the exchange to read it the same way she had. He's going to find a reason to make this his problem, Thomas said. He doesn't need a reason. He just needs an opening. Vesta looked toward the granite wall, toward the crack that had become in the space of 6 weeks the single most important fact of their lives. We need to make sure there isn't one. What that meant practically she didn't yet know. And the not knowing sat uneasily in her chest through the following days, even as the work in the basin continued, because the cold outside continued, and there was no luxury of pausing to worry properly. She and Asa began clearing space along the floor for what she'd started imagining as a kitchen preparation shelf in the first widened stretch of the passage, broad enough to stand in where she could sort and cut without the smoke of a fire collecting in the chamber's fissures. Thomas, seated on an overturned crate with his bad legs stretched in front of him, sketched measurements onto a scrap of paper and called out corrections as she worked. And in the small economy of that division of labor, Vesta found something steadying a rhythm that asked nothing of her but the next task in the one after it. It was on one of those afternoons with Asa underfoot, collecting white pebbles from the basin floor, that he'd taken to lining up along the edge of the sleeping platform, that Eli Marrow came calling the blacksmith who'd worked the territory longer than most, and who had, Vesta would learn before the week was out, a history with surveying that none of his current neighbors knew much about. He'd come to return a tool Thomas had lent him in September, an errand simple enough on its surface, except that he lingered at the granite wall in a way that suggested he already knew more than the errand explained. Heard talk in town? He said, his voice carrying the unhurried economy of a man who'd long since stopped wasting words on people who didn't deserve the full ones. Figured I'd see for myself before I decided whether the talk was foolish. And is it foolish? Vesta asked. He looked at the crack in the rock for a long moment, and something in his face shifted from polite curiosity into something closer to recognition. No, he said, it is not foolish. Come and show me what's behind it if you'll have me. She brought him through, watched his weathered face take in the basin, the way Hank Pruitt's son had described his own father reacting weeks earlier, a stillness that lasted longer than most visitors managed. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped into something more careful. I surveyed land for the Army years back before I ever picked up a hammer for a living. He said it plainly without pride attached to it, the way a man states a fact about a former life that no longer concerns him much except when it does. I know how a boundary gets read wrong, and I know how a man like Bartholomew Stroud reads a boundary when he wants it to bend his direction. Especially a man with a banknote hanging over him that's coming due before next winter. Vesta turned to look at him fully. You know about the note. Everybody in Fortune's Rest knows about the note by now, Mrs. Calloway, even if nobody says it to his face. A man doesn't borrow against blackleg losses and keep it quiet in a valley this small. Eli's eyes moved across the chamber once more. The seep wall, the shelves, the column of light falling through the fissures, Vesta had widened with her own hands. Question is whether your boundary markers run where you think they run or where the original filing happened to put them without anybody checking close. Most homestead claims weren't drawn with care. They were drawn fast by men in a hurry on ground nobody expected to matter beyond the grazing on it. And if ours was drawn the same way, then whatever's behind that crack might sit just outside the line your husband's family staked, however unintentional that ever was. He said it gently, but the gentleness didn't soften the weight of it. I'd want to know that before Stroud finds out and tells you himself on his own terms. That night, Vesta couldn't settle, and she sat at the cabin table long after Thomas had gone to bank the fire and check on Asa in the basin, going over the boundary papers Thomas's father had filed years before any of them had set foot on this ground, trying to read in faded ink and unfamiliar surveying language, whether the granite wall fell inside the claim or merely beside it. She found no clear answer in the paper itself, only the suspicion that the question had never been asked in the first place, because nobody filing that claim had imagined a rock face mattering enough to measure precisely. She thought of Stroud's careful smile, his eyes moving toward the granite while his mouth talked about her husband's leg. She thought of 16 years of a man's certainty about what this valley would and wouldn't yield, propped up now by a debt he couldn't speak of openly, and what it might do to a man like that to discover he'd been wrong about ground he'd ridden past his whole life at the very moment he most needed to be right about something. She thought, too, of the column of light falling across her son's upturned face, the first morning they'd stood in that basin together, and of the warmth in the stone that had felt after 3 cold winters almost unearned. Whatever Stroud intended, she decided, sitting alone with the lamp burned low and the wind finding its way through the cabin's old chinking. The way it always did this time of year, she was not going to lose this by failing to look closely at what she already had. She folded the boundary papers and set them aside, and resolved that come morning she would ride to Fortune's Rest herself and ask the land agent the question Eli Merrow had raised before anyone else had the chance to ask it for her on terms she wouldn't get to choose. The frost had thickened on the cabin window by the time she finally blew out the lamp, and somewhere beyond the wall, faint enough that she had to hold her breath to catch it, she could still hear the basin's quiet water finding its way through stone, patient and unbothered by anything happening above it, as though the mountain itself had already decided how this would end and was simply waiting for the rest of them to catch up. The land agent's office in Fortune's Rest smelled of paper dust and the cold ash of a stove that hadn't caught yet that morning, and the young man behind the desk, a clerk named Whitfield who'd taken the post the previous spring, pulled the Calloway file with the careful precision of someone who had learned the hard way that sloppy filing made enemies of people who had every right to be angry about it. He laid the original claim map flat under the window light and traced the eastern boundary with one finger, and Vesta watched his face for the small shift that would tell her the answer before his mouth did. The line runs along the base of the formation, he said finally, and his voice carried the particular regret of a man delivering news he understood would land hard. As filed, which would put the rock face itself and anything behind it just outside the marked claim. The words settled cold into her chest, the way a draft settles when a door's been left open too long, not sudden, just steady and complete. That can't be right. The marker my husband's father set. I'm only reading what's on the page, Mrs. Calloway. I'd need to verify against the actual stone in the field before I'd swear to anything. Whitfield looked up at her, and something in his careful manner suggested he already knew more than the file alone could tell him. There's also this. A preliminary mineral survey application came in 3 days ago, filed against the same formation, citing it as ground adjacent to your eastern line, prospectively valuable outside existing claim. Filed by who? She already knew the answer before she finished asking it. Bartholomew Stroud. She rode home with the wind cutting sideways across the trail, in the cold finding every gap in her coat, the way it found the chinking in the cabin walls. And by the time the shelf of land came into view, she had run through every version of the conversation she would need to have with Thomas, and none of them made the news sit any lighter. He was at the table when she came in, the lamp already lit against the early dark, and she told him plainly because there had never been a version of their marriage where she dressed bad news up before handing it over. He has standing now, Thomas said after a long silence in which she watched him work through the same arithmetic she'd already worked through twice on the ride. An application doesn't need to be true to create a problem. It only needs to exist while somebody decides if it's true. And if the survey finds nothing, which it will because there's no ore in that rock, then the application fails and we file to amend the boundary properly, and this becomes a story we tell years from now about a scare that came to nothing. Thomas's voice had none of the comfort his words were reaching for. But while it's pending, anything we've built on that rock face could be called an improvement to ground that isn't legally ours yet. We could be made to answer for it. Asa had been listening from the basin entrance where he'd come up for supper, and his face had gone pale in a way that made Vesta's chest ache with a different kind of cold. Are they going to take it away from us? No. She said it with more certainty than she had any right to feel, because a boy his age needed an answer he could hold on to, even if the adults in the room were still working out whether the answer was true. Not while I'm still standing here to stop it. Work on the basin halted the following morning, not because either of them believed Stroud's claim had merit, but because Thomas had been clear about the risk of building further on contested ground, and Vesta, however much it cost her to leave the shelves half-finished and the kitchen preparation area unfinished, understood the sense in his caution. What she could not halt was her own mind, which kept returning through the long, cold days that followed to the boundary marker Eli Marrow had warned her about, the stone that may or may not have been set where the old filing claimed it sat. She found Eli at his forge on a morning when the sky hung low and gray and the air smelled like the snow that hadn't quite committed to falling yet. And she told him what Whitfield had said, watching his weathered face for the same recognition she'd seen in the basin weeks before. I'd need to walk it myself to know for certain, he said, setting down the iron he'd been working. But I'll tell you something for nothing, Mrs. Calloway. A boundary marker doesn't move on its own. If the line on that paper runs along the base of the rock instead of around the corner of it, somebody made that choice when they set the stone, careless or otherwise. The question worth asking isn't what the paper says. It's where the actual marker sits and what it was meant to encompass when a man's boot was standing next to it. Will you walk it with me? I'll teach you to walk it yourself. He said it without unkindness, but with a firmness that told her this was not an offer up for negotiation. You're the one whose name needs to stand behind the measurement when it matters, not mine. What followed was a week of mornings Vesta would later describe to no one in full, because the particulars felt too private to hand over. Hauling a measuring chain across frozen ground, with Eli walking beside her. Her work gloves cracked at the knuckles from the cold, the wool of her shawl pulled tight against a wind that never let up. Teaching her to read the old cornerstones the way he'd been taught decades earlier, in service to an Army survey crew. How to cite a straight line between two markers, how to account for the slope of the land, when distance on paper didn't match distance on the ground. Her hands cracked further despite the gloves. Her knees ached from kneeling at each stone to check its position against the chain. And somewhere in the third morning of it crouched at the southeastern corner marker, with frost whitening the grass around her boots. She understood with sudden clarity that she had stopped doing this because Eli told her it mattered, and had started doing it because she needed for her own sake to know the truth of her own land with her own hands, rather than trusting it to anyone else's account of it. There, she said on the fourth morning, her voice catching on something between triumph and disbelief, as she stood at the eastern corner marker and sighted the line running not along the base of the granite wall, as the old paper implied, but around its outer corner, exactly where the formation's edge met open ground. The marker doesn't sit at the base, Eli, it sits past it. The whole rock face is inside the line. Eli walked the sight line himself, slow and deliberate, before he allowed his face to show any agreement. Your husband's father set that stone with more care than the paper ever gave him credit for, he said finally. Whether he understood at the time what was inside that rock, I can't say. But he didn't draw a sloppy line. Somebody transcribing it later did. The relief that moved through Vesta in that moment was so sharp it nearly buckled her knees, and she had to stand a moment with her hand against the cold stone of the marker before she trusted her own legs again. But the relief didn't last the ride home, because relief on paper and relief in practice were not the same animal. And she knew even as she carried the news back to Thomas that knowing a thing and proving it to a land office clerk who'd already entered Stroud's application into the record were two very different undertakings. Thomas listened to her account at the table that evening with the particular stillness he reserved for problems he was already 3 steps into solving before he said a word. And when she finished, he reached for a fresh sheet of paper and began transcribing the measurements in his own careful hand, cross-referencing them against the filed map Whitfield had shown her. If this is accurate, he said, working through it a second time, the application Stroud filed has no ground to stand on. He filed against adjacent rock. If the rock isn't adjacent, if it's interior to our own line, there's nothing adjacent left for his survey to examine. Will Whitfield see it the same way? Whitfield will see what the numbers show him if the numbers are sound. Thomas set down his pencil and looked at her with something that had been absent from his face since the application first arrived. A flicker of the certainty that had once come easily to him before the leg and the long winters had worn some of it down. And their sound Vesta, you walked every foot of that line yourself. It was Asa who delivered the next piece of the puzzle, though none of them recognized it as a piece worth examining until days later. He'd been quieter than usual since the night the survey application was first mentioned, carrying the particular guilt of a boy who suspected without anyone confirming it to him directly that his own loose talk at school had played some part in bringing Stroud's attention down on the family. He spent his afternoons in the cabin rather than the basin working through his small collection of pebbles with a focus that looked less like play and more like penance. And it was during one of those afternoons that he found tucked into the lining of an old trunk that had belonged to his grandfather, a folded survey notation that nobody in the family had known still existed. "Mama." He brought it to her at the table, his voice uncertain as though he expected to be told he'd found something that wasn't his to find. This was in the bottom of the trunk, under the lining. The paper was brittle and water-stained at one corner, but the handwriting was legible enough, a notation in an older hand describing the eastern corner marker's placement at the outer edge of the rock formation, per agreement with the surveying party to encompass the full granite outcrop within the bounds of the claim. It was dated 11 years before Vesta had ever set foot on this land, signed with the initial of a surveyor's name she didn't recognize, and it confirmed in language plainer than anything the official filed map had shown exactly what she and Eli had measured with their own hands. "This was grandfather's," Asa said, watching her face carefully. "Did I do something good this time?" "You did something very good." She pulled him into a hug that surprised them both with its intensity, feeling the small frame of him relax against her, some of the guilt he'd been carrying since the leak at school finally loosening its hold. "You found exactly what we needed." Thomas examined the notation that evening with the same careful attention he'd given the boundary measurements, and his face, when he finally looked up, carried an expression Vesta hadn't seen on him in longer than she wanted to admit. "This changes the conversation entirely," he said. "It's not just our measurement against the filed map anymore. It's a contemporaneous notation made at the time of the original survey confirming the intent of the line. Whitfield can't dismiss that as easily as he could dismiss a wife's chain measurement, however accurate." "A wife's chain measurement was accurate enough to find this," Vesta said, with an edge she didn't fully apologize for, and Thomas, to his credit, didn't argue the point. The federal surveyor's visit was scheduled for the second week of December. A man named Cornelius Marsh, who'd been conducting examinations across the territory for over a decade, and who arrived at the shelf with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had long since stopped being impressed or alarmed by anything a homestead dispute might throw at him. He set his chains without comment, checked his instruments against the cold, and listened to Vesta's account of the corner markers with an expression that gave away nothing of what he thought of it, scratching notations into a notebook he didn't share with anyone present. Stroud arrived uninvited partway through the examination, his horse blowing hard from a fast ride, his manner stripped of the careful neighborliness he'd worn during his first visit weeks before. He stood at a distance from the working party, watching Marcia's instruments, with an intensity that told Vesta more clearly than anything he might have said aloud exactly how much he had riding on this particular morning's findings. "Mr. Marsh," Stroud called out when the surveyor finally straightened from his instruments, "I'd appreciate knowing your preliminary impression if you formed one." "I don't form impressions, Mr. Stroud." Marsh's voice carried no particular warmth toward either party present. "I form measurements. The impression follows the numbers, not the other way around." He walked the eastern boundary twice more, comparing the corner markers against both the original filed map and the notation Asa had found his weathered face, giving nothing away even as he paused longer than necessary at the southeastern stone, the same one where Vesta had first sighted the true line weeks earlier. When he finally closed his notebook, the silence that followed stretched long enough that Vesta felt her own pulse in her ears. "The formation." Marsh said, his voice flat and procedural, the voice of a man reading a fact rather than rendering a verdict, "sits entirely within the corner markers as originally set and as confirmed by contemporaneous notation. There is no ground exterior to this claim available for the mineral survey as described in the Stroud application." Stroud's face didn't move for a long moment, and Vesta watched something happen behind his eyes that looked less like defeat and more like a man recalculating, searching for another angle before the ground had even finished settling under the first one. "The notation's authenticity hasn't been established," he said. "A scrap of paper from a trunk proves nothing. It corroborates a measurement already taken independently." Marsh's tone didn't shift. "The application as filed has no basis. I'll record that finding and forward it to the district office." Stroud said nothing further. He turned his horse and rode back down the valley without another word, and Vesta watched him go with a relief that felt thinner than she wanted it to, because something in the set of his shoulders as he rode away told her this was not a man who absorbed a loss and let it lie quiet. She was right to feel that thinness. Less than a week later, word reached the shelf through Eli, who'd heard it from a rancher passing through Fortune's Rest, that Stroud had begun telling a different story around town, one that had nothing to do with mineral surveys and everything to do with suggesting, in the careful, deniable way of a man who never quite says the thing he means, that a woman running a homestead with a husband too lame to work it properly was bound to cut corners that put the whole valley's understanding of fair claim filing at risk. It was not an accusation that could be answered in a land office. It was the kind of talk that worked itself into a community's opinion slowly, the way water works into stone. And Vesta felt the particular helplessness of facing an enemy who had stopped fighting her on paper and started fighting her in the only court that mattered more than any federal surveyor's notebook, the court of what her neighbors believed about her. "Let him talk," Thomas said when she told him what Eli had reported, though his jaw had tightened in a way that betrayed how little comfort he found in his own advice. "Talk doesn't move a boundary marker. Talk moves everything else." Vesta stood at the cabin window, watching the gray afternoon light fail early the way it did this time of year. "It moves who lends us tools next spring. It moves who speaks for us if there's ever a vote on water rights or grazing or anything else this valley decides by consensus instead of law. I've watched it happen to other families, Thomas. A man doesn't need to win in court if he can win in every conversation that happens after the court's already ruled against him." That night, unable to settle, she walked out to the granite wall alone, the cold biting through her coat, and stood at the crack in the stone for a long while before she found the will to go in. The lantern light she carried fell across the basin in its familiar warm glow, the seep running its quiet, continuous note, Asa's row of pebbles undisturbed at the edge of the sleeping platform where he'd left them. She sat on the cold floor near the warm stone and let herself feel fully the weight of everything that had happened since the morning her son first pressed his palm against this wall and declared it breathing. She thought of the federal surveyor's flat procedural voice delivering a verdict she'd fought weeks to earn. She thought of Stroud's face failing to move when he heard it recalculating instead of conceding. She thought with a clarity that startled her that winning the boundary had not ended the fight at all. It had only moved the fight somewhere the law couldn't reach. What use is being right, she thought, sitting in the warm dark with the water running its patient note beside her, if being right doesn't stop a man like that from finding some other way to take what he's decided belongs to him. She didn't have an answer that night, but she stayed long enough in that warm chamber with the mountain holding its quiet certainty around her that something in her chest hardened into a resolve she hadn't fully possessed when she'd walked in. Whatever Stroud intended to try next, she would not be the woman who waited passively to discover it. She would be the woman who walked toward it first. The following morning, she rode to Fortune's Rest a second time, not to the land office this time, but to the general store where she knew the kind of talk Eli had described would already be circulating among the men who gathered near the stove on cold mornings to trade news before the day's work began. She walked in with her chin level and her voice steady, her good shawl pinned at the collar, the way her mother had taught her to dress for a room she meant to command, rather than merely enter, and she did not avoid the subject the way a guilty woman might have. She spoke plainly about the rock formation, about what her family had found and built, about the surveyor's finding, and what it meant for the boundary, and she watched the men's faces shift from careful neutrality to something closer to respect as she refused to apologize for any part of what she'd done. "Heard you've got something remarkable out there," one of the older ranchers said, not unkindly testing the water of her composure. "I've got something I worked hard for," she said, "same as anyone in this room has worked hard for what they hold. I'd think a man would understand that better than he'd understand whatever Stroud's been telling him instead." It was not a triumph, not entirely, but she rode home that afternoon with the sense that she had at least stopped the water from working its way into the stone unanswered. And when she told Thomas what she'd done, he looked at her with an expression that carried more than simple agreement. "You didn't have to ride in there alone." "I did, though." She set down the parcel of supplies she'd bought, her hands still cold from the ride. "Some fights, Thomas, a woman has to walk into herself, or she spends the rest of her life letting other people decide what's true about her." December settled deeper into winter, and the cold outside made the basin's steady warmth feel less like a curiosity and more like the difference between a hard season and an impossible one. Work resumed on the chamber once Marsh's official finding was recorded, and the amendment to the boundary filing was underway through Whitfield's office, and Vesta threw herself back into it with an intensity that left little room for the worry still sitting under her ribs about what Stroud might attempt next. The kitchen preparation shelf was finished by the second week, the vegetable stores expanded along the northern ledges, and Thomas, despite the leg, found ways to make himself useful that didn't require standing, measuring and cutting and directing with a precision that filled in for what his body could no longer easily do. Asa had taken to spending most evenings in the basin nook rather than the cabin proper, drawn by the steady warmth and the quiet. And one evening, Vesta found him sitting cross-legged near the seep wall, with his collection of pebbles arranged in a careful row, counting them under his breath. 11, he announced when he noticed her watching. "I started with 3, now I've got 11. That's a fine collection. Papa says nothing in this whole territory is like this place." He looked up at her with the particular seriousness he reserved for questions that mattered to him more than he usually let on. "Is that true? Is there really nothing else like it?" "I don't know if that's true," she said, sitting beside him on the cold floor that no longer felt entirely cold this close to the seep. "But I know it's true for us, and right now that's the only version of true that matters." He seemed satisfied with that, returning his attention to his pebbles, and Vesta sat with him a while longer, watching the lantern light move across the basin's fissured ceiling, allowing herself a small measure of the peace the chamber had first offered them weeks before. It did not last the full evening. Eli arrived just past dark with his horse blowing hard from a ride made too fast for the cold, and the look on his face when Thomas let him into the cabin told Vesta before he'd said a single word that whatever quiet they'd managed to claim that evening had already run out. "Stroud's filed again," Eli said, his breath still ragged from the cold ride. "Different ground this time. He's not arguing the boundary anymore. He's arguing fitness." "Fitness for what?" Thomas's voice had gone carefully flat, the particular flatness Vesta recognized as a man bracing himself before he knew the full shape of what he was bracing against. "Fitness to hold the claim at all." Eli's eyes moved between the two of them, and Vesta felt the floor of the cabin seem to tilt slightly under her, though nothing in the room had actually moved. "He's filed a petition with the territorial court arguing the homestead requirements weren't properly met, given Thomas's injury and the burden it's placed on the household's ability to work the land as required under the original filing terms. He's asking the court to review whether the claim should stand at all." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight that presses on a chest the way deep water presses, and Vesta felt Thomas go very still beside her, his hand finding the edge of the table as though he needed something solid to hold, while the ground she'd fought so hard to secure suddenly seemed to shift under an entirely different kind of attack, one that had nothing to do with rock formations or boundary lines, and everything to do with the body he could no longer fully command, and the unspoken fear finally given voice by a stranger's legal filing that his injury might cost his family everything they had built, not because the land wasn't theirs by right, but because the court might decide they hadn't earned the right to keep it. Thomas didn't sleep that night, and Vesta knew it because she didn't sleep either. Both of them lying in the dark of the cabin, listening to the wind work at the chinking, while their minds worked at the same impossible problem from opposite directions. He was thinking she suspected about every task he could no longer manage, without help cataloging his own limitations, with the same precision he applied to boundary measurements, building a case against himself before any judge had the chance to. She was thinking about what it would mean to stand in a courtroom and answer for her husband's worth as a homesteader, as though a man's leg determined the value of everything else he carried. "It's not fair," he said finally somewhere past midnight, his voice carrying none of the careful flatness he'd worn in front of Eli. "To make this about whether I'm whole enough. It's not about whether you're whole." Vesta turned toward him in the dark. "It's about whether Stroud's found a way to make people afraid of the wrong question." "What's the right question then?" "Whether this land is worked, whether it's productive, whether a family lives on it and makes something of it." She found his hand under the quilt cold despite the blankets. "Not whether every pair of hands on it moves the way it moved before the wagon wheel." He didn't answer that directly, but his grip tightened around her fingers, and she understood that this was the closest he could come that night to believing what she'd said, rather than simply hearing it. They rode to Fortune's Rest together the following morning, Thomas insisting on coming, despite the cold and the ache the saddle put in his leg, because he would not let her stand before a clerk and answer questions about his own fitness without standing there to answer some of them himself. Whitfield received them with the particular discomfort of a young man caught between procedure and sympathy, laying out the petition Stroud had filed in language that confirmed everything Eli had reported the night before. Careful legal phrasing built around the Homestead Act's requirement that a claimant demonstrate continuous habitation and cultivation sufficient to the land's productive use. "The petition argues," Whitfield said, not quite meeting Thomas's eyes, "that given the documented injury and given Mrs. Calloway's necessarily expanded role in physical labor, the household may not meet the standard of cultivation envisioned by the original act. It's requesting a formal review." "A review conducted by whom?" Vesta asked. "A circuit judge. There's one due through the district in about 3 weeks' time. Judge Harlan Pruitt. He'll hear the petition alongside several other matters on his docket while he's passing through." 3 weeks felt in that moment like both an eternity and no time at all. And Vesta rode home turning the number over in her mind, the way she'd once turned over the question of whether 90 logs would be enough wood to see them through winter, except that this calculation had no chisel or chain to make it solvable, only the uncertain mathematics of a stranger's judgment. What she did not expect in the days that followed was the form her own fear would eventually take, because it did not arrive as panic, but as a kind of cold clarity that settled over her, the way a hard frost settles over a field after a clear night total in uniform. She began almost without deciding to building a different kind of case than the one Whitfield had described, one that had nothing to do with legal phrasing and everything to do with what a judge could see with his own eyes if she gave him the chance to see it. "I want him to come to the land," she told Thomas one evening, the idea arriving fully formed in a way that surprised her even as she said it aloud. "Not just hear testimony about it in some borrowed room in town. I want Judge Pruitt standing on our ground, looking at what we've built before anyone tells him a single word about what we haven't." Circuit judges don't typically conduct site visits for petitions like this. "Then we ask him to make an exception." She held his gaze steadily. "What's the harm in asking Thomas? The worst he says is no, and we're no further behind than we already are." Eli, when she brought the idea to him at his forge, considered it with the unhurried attention he gave most things, turning the question over before he answered. "Judges like Pruitt built their reputations on practical judgment, not just paper. I've seen him rule on water disputes before. He walked the creek bed himself before he decided who got first draw in dry years. A man like that might welcome the chance to see for himself rather than take Stroud's word over yours secondhand." It was Eli, too, who suggested the second piece of the strategy, the part Vesta hadn't fully considered until he raised it. "You'll want witnesses who aren't kin," he said. "Neighbors who've seen what your family's built with their own eyes, who can speak to the work itself rather than the wagon wheel that hurt Thomas's leg." The Pruitts, maybe, if they're willing. Folks who can say plainly that this household produces more than most lame leg or no. The petition for a site visit was filed within the week, and Whitfield, to his quiet credit, pushed it through with more speed than Vesta had expected, perhaps, because he'd seen enough of the family's circumstances firsthand to want the matter resolved fairly, rather than dragged through a borrowed courtroom built on rumor. Word came back that Judge Pruitt had agreed, citing his own preference for direct evidence where the circumstances permitted it, and the date was set for the second week of January, well ahead of where the original hearing would otherwise have landed. What followed was not the kind of preparation Vesta had imagined when she'd first stood at the granite crack with her son 2 months earlier, but it carried its own particular weight, the work of making visible to a stranger's eyes what the family had spent a season building with their own hands. She walked the shelf and the basin both with a critical eye. She'd never turned on her own work before seeing it suddenly as evidence, rather than simply as home. And she found herself in the days before the judge's visit, working alongside Thomas in ways that reshaped how she thought about what his hands could still do. "Sit there," she told him one afternoon, positioning a low stool near the kitchen preparation shelf in the passage, "and show me how you'd manage the inventory ledger if I weren't standing here to ask." He looked at her for a long moment before understanding this settled into his face, and then he reached for the ledger she'd kept of stores and supplies and began walking her through it with the same careful precision he'd once brought to harness repair, cross-referencing quantities against the season's needs, flagging where the dried meat stores ran thinner than he'd like, calculating what the spring planting would require against what they already had on hand. It was not labor in the way a judge might expect to measure a homesteader's worth, but it was labor all the same, the kind that kept a household from starving as surely as a strong back kept it from freezing. "This is what I do," he said when he'd finished, something raw in his voice that hadn't been there before. "While you're hauling stone and chasing boundary chains, this is what I do, and I've spent a year and a half feeling like it wasn't enough to count for anything." "It counts for everything, Thomas." She knelt beside the stool, taking the ledger from his hands and setting it aside so she could take his hands instead. "I haven't burned through a winter yet without running short of something I forgot to plan for, because you remember every detail I don't have time to hold in my head while I'm splitting wood. That's not lesser work, it's different work, and a household needs both to survive." Asa, watching from the basin entrance where he'd wandered to find them, asked the question that had clearly been sitting in him since Eli's news weeks before. "Is the judge going to make us leave?" "No," Vesta said with the same firmness she'd offered him in November, except this time the firmness had something underneath it that hadn't fully existed before, a conviction built from weeks of measuring and arguing and refusing to let other people's doubts settle into her own bones. "He's going to come here and see what we've made, and then he's going to understand that this family belongs on this ground exactly as much as any family with two whole-bodied parents ever did." The morning Judge Harlan Pruitt arrived was bitterly cold, the sky scrubbed clean and pale frost thick enough on the ground to crunch underfoot. And Vesta had been up since well before dawn, making certain every detail of the homestead presented itself honestly, not staged, simply true to what it actually was. She wore her good wool dress for the occasion, the collar buttoned to the throat against the cold, her boots laced tight against the frozen ground. The judge himself proved to be a heavy-set man in his 60s, with a face weathered by decades of riding circuit through every kind of territory dispute the frontier could produce. His manner unhurried in a way that reminded her oddly of Eli's careful patience. Stroud was already waiting when the judge's party arrived, having ridden out earlier with 2 men. Vesta didn't recognize witnesses, presumably brought to speak against the family's fitness, and his face carried the particular satisfaction of a man who believed the morning's proceedings would finally settle in his favor, what the boundary dispute had failed to settle weeks earlier. "Judge Pruitt!" Stroud stepped forward before Vesta had fully dismounted, his voice pitched for the judge's ear alone, though it carried easily enough in the still cold air. "I appreciate you making the ride out. I think once you've seen the strain this household's under, you'll understand the concern isn't malicious. It's simply practical." "I'll form my own understanding of what's practical, Mr. Stroud, once I've seen what there is to see." Pruitt's tone wasn't unkind, but it carried no particular warmth towards Stroud, either the flat neutrality of a man who had heard 1,000 opening arguments and learned to discount most of them until the evidence caught up. Vesta led the judge first to the fields nearest the cabin, showing him the oat stubble from the autumn harvest, modest by the standards of richer ground further down the valley, but consistent across 3 seasons, and then to the smokehouse where the season's cured meat hung in neat rows, and then finally toward the granite wall itself, where the crack in the stone waited dark and unremarkable from the outside, giving no hint of what lay behind it. "This is the formation at the center of the boundary matter," she said, gesturing toward the gap. "And it's also, I think, the clearest evidence of what this household has managed despite whatever Mr. Stroud believes we're incapable of." She led him through the passage with a lantern, Thomas following slower behind on his bad leg, refusing the offered arm of one of Pruitt's attendants. And when the chamber opened into its familiar fissured light, Vesta watched the judge's face do something she hadn't quite expected. A flicker of genuine astonishment that broke briefly through his professional composure before he caught himself and resumed the careful neutrality of a man conducting an examination. "Remarkable," he said, quiet almost to himself, taking in the seep wall, the shelves lined with stores, the warm air moving against the bitter cold they'd left outside. "I've heard talk of unusual ground in this territory before. Most of it amounts to less than the talk suggested. This does not. My husband redirected that water channel himself," Vesta said, gesturing toward the seep seated because standing too long on the bad leg isn't possible for him yet. "He measured every plank on these shelves from that same seated position, and the inventory that keeps this family fed through winter exists because he tracks it with more precision than I'd manage standing on two good legs and trying to hold it all in my head at once." Pruitt turned to look at Thomas directly, his expression unreadable. "Is that an accurate account, Mr. Calloway?" "It's accurate." Thomas met the judge's gaze steadily, and Vesta heard something in his voice she hadn't heard since before the accident, a settled confidence that didn't apologize for what his body could no longer do, only stated plainly what it could. "I won't pretend the leg hasn't changed what's expected of me day to day. But a homestead isn't built by one pair of legs alone, Your Honor. It's built by whoever does the work that needs doing, however that work gets divided between two people who've decided to carry it together." Stroud, watching from near the passage entrance where he'd followed against Vesta's preference, found his moment to speak. "With respect, Your Honor, the act requires the claimant himself to cultivate the land, not delegate the bulk of the labor to—" "The act requires the claim to be worked, Mr. Stroud." Pruitt's voice carried for the first time since his arrival an edge that hadn't been there before. "It does not specify which member of a household must swing which tool, nor does it concern itself with the precise division of labor between a husband and wife, provided the land in question is productively held. I've ruled on a great many homestead matters in this territory, and I've yet to find that particular requirement anywhere in the statute, though I'd welcome you showing it to me if you believe it exists." The silence that followed carried a different quality than the silences that had come before it in this story. Not the held breath of uncertainty, but the particular stillness of a man watching his own argument collapse under its own weight. And Vesta felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since Eli's cold ride to deliver the news weeks earlier. Pruitt walked the remainder of the chamber in silence, examining the shelves, the seep. The column of light falling through the fissures Vesta had widened with her own chisel. And when he finally turned back toward the passage, his manner had settled into something closer to decision than examination. "I've seen enough to form a judgment," he said, addressing Vesta and Thomas both rather than Stroud. "This household has demonstrated cultivation and productive use of the claim that exceeds by some measure what I've observed on homesteads with no injury at all to account for. I'll record my finding accordingly, and I'd advise Mr. Stroud's petition be withdrawn before it reaches formal hearing, since I see no basis on which it would succeed." Stroud's face had gone rigid, the satisfaction of the morning's opening fully drained from it, replaced by something Vesta recognized from the boundary dispute weeks earlier, the particular stillness of a man recalculating rather than conceding. "This isn't finished," he said low enough that it might have been meant only for himself, though Vesta heard it clearly enough in the cold, still air of the basin. "I believe it is Mr. Stroud," Pruitt said, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for argument. "I'd suggest you direct your energies elsewhere going forward before that note coming due finds you with even less to show the bank than you started with." The remark landed harder than anything else said that morning, and Vesta understood, watching Stroud's face go gray around the mouth, that the judge had known about the debt all along, perhaps longer than she had, and had simply waited for the moment it would do the most good to say so plainly. Stroud left without further word, riding out ahead of his own witnesses, who lingered a moment longer in evident discomfort before following him down the trail. And Vesta stood at the granite wall watching them go, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes after a fight finally won rather than merely survived. But the relief when she allowed herself to fully feel it that evening carried a complicated weight alongside it because she understood watching Thomas across the supper table with color in his face she hadn't seen there in months, that something larger than a boundary dispute or a fitness petition had been settled that day. She had spent 18 months quietly believing without ever saying it aloud, even to herself, that the work of holding this family together had become hers alone to carry, that Thomas's injury had left a gap only her own strength could fill. Watching him answer Pruitt's questions with that settled confidence, watching the judge weigh his account as seriously as he weighed anything she herself had shown him, she understood how wrong that quiet belief had been, and how much it had cost both of them for her to carry it unspoken for so long. "You held your ground today," she told him after Asa had gone to sleep in the basin nook and the cabin had settled into its evening quiet. "We held it together." He reached across the table for her hand. "I think I'd forgotten how to believe that until today gave me a reason to remember it." January deepened into the kind of cold that tested every seam in the cabin's old construction, but the basin held its steady warmth against it, and the vegetables along the seep wall that Vesta had pressed into the damp clay back in autumn continued their slow, improbable growth. Green shoots thickening week by week in defiance of a season that should have killed them outright. Eli came by often that month, no longer merely a neighbor offering caution, but something closer to family, by the steady accumulation of shared trouble, weathered together. And on one visit in late January, he brought news that settled the last loose thread of the season's conflict. "Stroud's pulled up stakes," he said, warming his hands at the cabin fire. "Selling his herd to cover the note by what I hear and moving south before spring thaw." Whatever was eating at that man-your boundary line and Pruitt's ruling together seemed to have finished the job, same as the debt he couldn't outrun any other way. Vesta absorbed that news with less satisfaction than she might have expected weeks earlier, when Stroud's name alone had been enough to tighten something cold in her chest. "I don't take pleasure in a man losing everything he built here," she said. "I take pleasure in him not taking ours." "Those aren't the same feeling," Eli agreed, "but they're not opposites either." Spring came slow that year, the way it always did at this elevation. But when it finally arrived in earnest, the difference the basin had made to the household's fortunes showed itself plainly in ways no judge or land office filing could have measured. The herb garden along the seep wall had spread to cover most of the eastern stretch of stone and the tomato starts. Vesta had nursed through winter in the cabin window. Transferred down into the basin's steady warmth in April, were bearing small green fruit by early summer, something she had never once managed on the open ground above, where the growing season ran too short and the nights stayed too cold even at the height of July. Hank Pruitt, riding out in June with his family to see for himself what the valley's talk had been circling for months, stood at the seep wall studying the tomato vines with the particular disbelief of a man recalculating everything he'd assumed about a piece of ground he'd known his whole life. 16 years this valley said your shelf was good for nothing but rock and wind," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Stroud said it loudest of anybody, and look what was sitting under his nose the whole time, waiting on someone willing to look at it twice." "It needed someone willing to look at it twice," Vesta said, "and a boy who trusted what his own hand told him before anybody had a chance to tell him otherwise." Asa, sitting nearby on the warm stone floor with his pebble collection arranged in its careful row beside him, looked up at the mention of himself with the easy, unself-conscious pride of a child who had never doubted from the very first morning that the rock was breathing exactly the way he'd said it was. He counted the tomatoes coming in along the vine, then added one more white pebble to his collection from a corner of the basin floor. He'd somehow not yet searched in 8 months of near-daily visits, because there was always, it seemed, one more thing. This place was willing to give up to someone patient enough to keep looking. The light fell through the fissures above in its familiar gold column, shifting slow across the basin floor as the afternoon wore on, and somewhere beneath the quiet murmur of family voices and Asa's careful counting, the seep ran its same patient note. It had run every day since the morning. A boy first pressed his palm to cold granite and insisted against every grown reason to doubt him that something warm was waiting on the other side.